Good morning. Maybe for somebody that's already good afternoon. But I am very grateful to everybody who joined us on Saturday at 11 to listen to what we're going to talk about and to discuss. I think that we are all heroes. I think that we have today the third last day of culture. My name is Oksana Forostina. I'm a curator of this last day, which is called Theatrocracy. I would like to use this opportunity while we are all gathering here and still finishing drinking our coffee. I would like to express my gratitude for all organizers for two perfect, extremely interesting, and as for me, even in some moments, sensational days. This Cultural Strategy Institute, which is an organizer of the Congress, is it's NGO Vermanska 35. Renaissance, International Fund Renaissance, which also supported Congress, including financially. We are in Lviv City Hall right now, and apart from the fact that they let us be here, they also support all those reconducted days. And also, I think I will express my gratitude on the behalf of all of my colleagues from the Culture Strategy Institute, Gem Factory, Harold Binder Cultural Enterprises, and Credo Bank. It seems to me that not all our guests left already, and the guests stayed in Leopolis Hotel, and we are really grateful on behalf of all of us. Today we have much smaller formats, not because of the premises, but also because all of the events but last are lectures. We thought that this first lecture of Peter Pomeranza is going to be a recording from the very beginning, because Peter Pomeranza is a British writer and media researcher. He is living currently in Washington. He is the senior researcher in Johns Hopkins University. He's dealing with program that is profoundly learning about disinformation and new media, and it is night at Washington right now, so we decided not to contact him through Zoom but record his lecture. He's going to talk in English, but on the screen you will see Ukrainian subtitles. Unfortunately, our lecturer Hanna Ulura was not able to come, and she will not able to join us in Zoom. This is a perfect, literally, critic who had to continue Peter's topic and talk about temptation of an artist by the power and those circles of mutual temptations. But I think that we will definitely be able to record Hanna when she gets better, and we will spread it in YouTube, and you will be able to watch it later in recording, because frankly speaking, I really like this chain. Also, we should have had our lecturer Yaroslava Striha be present here. She's also literary critic, translator, famous translator. She will be joining us through Zoom. Of course, it is not as great as Yaroslava in real life, but still we will be very grateful to see her, and it will be extremely interesting. I would like also to say a few words about Peter Pomerantsev and tell why Peter today we'll have this introduction to the topic for us. I think that you might have had an opportunity to at least see his books. Two of them are translated into Ukrainian. One of his books was published still in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. It was called Nothing is True, Everything is Possible. And in that, Peter was talking about his experience of work as a TV producer in Moscow. He is a producer of documentary movies on his first education, and he has spent 10 years in Moscow on Russian TV, and and he could observe a blurring of boundaries between reality and illusion from inside. Uh, but in his book, he was writing that about how political power is very brutal political power, not just uses TV and entertainment and plots, but it itself is enchanted by all those events. Just several days ago, I read a thing that seemed very comic for me. It turns out that Vladimir Putin really loves TV show House of Cards, and he even recommends it to his closest accomplices, like an educational movie, educational video. So that how everything works there. But why I find it comic is because people who really know this political world of Washington, of the USA, they tell that this TV show has nothing in common with how a political society in Washington really lives. These are people who live like monks. They go to sleep at 9 p.m. and there are no scandals, no sex, no drugs, whatever else was there in the TV show. Nothing is present there, at least not in such amounts, such quantities. So this combination of naive truth and practically non-limited power seemed on the one side maybe comic, but on the other side a little bit scary. And the second such moment, a little bit a little bit unexpected fear. It is also connected with the same House of Cards. It's appearance of Kevin Spacey, a person who was playing the main role, the main character, very cynic politician, American politician. His appearance in 2016 on the EU forum. He was invited by Viktor Pinchuk. He arrived there at that gala dinner like a surprise, and I remember how people shared their expression that he just enchanted a whole audience that consisted mostly of VIPs and very powerful people. But they were standing in line to take selfie with him. To actor who is playing cynical politician who is not really this world doesn't really look like real political world. And Peter, who was writing about this blurring of boundaries of those mutual reflections long time ago, still in 2013, it seems that that is the reason why he would be such a great leader to guide, to show, to talk about our topic. So I'm asking to switch on the video, and I will leave you at it.
Um, and I want to thank you for being at such a wonderful event. I've been asked to talk on a theme that's quite complicated. The theme of storytelling and politics in reality, and politics versus storytelling, or what happens when storytelling replaces politics. And I suppose I find that a hard theme because I think we always think in stories. I don't think there's any space outside of storytelling. We've always seen politics as a form of storytelling. So I suppose I wonder whether the question is not so much politics versus storytelling, but can we think of a more democratic storytelling or a democratic story as opposed to a more autocratic one? I mean, when we think about the allure of authoritarian or illiberal populist leaders, then their great sort of power is that they are very effective storytellers. The genius of Donald Trump was to take a complex and chaotic world and reduce it to these sort of caricatures, really. Crooked Hillary and Little Marco, these sort of like names like out of a cartoon strip that he gave his enemies. This authoritarian storytelling is very effective. It thinks in terms of conspiracy theories. It constructs a coherent enemy and an in-group that's under attack. I've written 2 books about this sort of authoritarian storytelling. I think we know it well. I don't think it's any revelation. But I'd like to think about our side, about what is democratic storytelling, and what's the role of journalism in that. Not just movies where we might talk about democratic values, but actually journalism. What is the relationship between journalism and media and storytelling and democracy? And so it's got a fresh thing for me to think about, and I've been thinking it through really as much as I can recently. And it always starts for me with something that's been happening a lot the last couple of years, these kind of letters and email messages and social media messages I get from friends in Burma, in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Syria, perhaps most of all, sort of asking me to write something about the horrible oppression and crimes against humanity in their countries, and saying, Peter, you can write articles, you can make a difference. And it's really got me thinking, can I? And how does one tell stories that do make a difference? I wanted to quote you one letter that I got recently. Dear Peter, I've been waiting to write to you for a long time, but the latest news has made it clear that it is simply dangerous to remain silent. My former colleagues are in prison for many months. My friends and I have found it difficult to get any attention from the world's media. Now, something has happened that caught the attention of the biggest news agencies, but I wonder how long it will last. Is there any way to hold the attention? I feel like we're all hostages here, and it's scary. Now everything, any crime, has become possible here. So that was a letter that I received from a friend in Belarus. It was a couple of days after the dictator Alexander Lukashenko used a MiG fighter jet to ground an international commercial tourist flight as it crossed his airspace, and proceeded to haul off an opposition Belarusian journalist and his girlfriend who had been living in supposed safety in Lithuania. A few days later, the captured journalist Roman Protasevich appeared on state TV, torture marks on his hands, and confessed to treachery in scenes right out of the Stalinist show trials. There was a certain amount of outrage among the international community and global media. The words hijacking and even terrorist act were used. And then, as my friend feared, it was forgotten. The consequences for Lukashenko were vaguely inconvenient, a ban on the Belarus state airline flying into Europe, but his message to anyone who dared to oppose him was far more potent. I will do what I want to you, anywhere you might be, and get away with it. For a long time, or really until this speech, I haven't really answered my friend's plea. I've had no idea how to write anything that holds attention, that adds up to more than the sum of just one article. For a single event to be remembered, it needs to be sustained by a bigger story that it flows into, and anyone who has ever played a memory game will know that you remember discrete things by putting them into a sequence where they take on a significance as part of a larger whole. It's likewise in media and politics. One scene only has power as part of a greater narrative. But Lukashenko's outrageous crimes haven't clicked into a greater chain of meaning, and it's not just Belarus. From Burma to Syria, as I mentioned, from Yemen to Sri Lanka, we have more evidence than ever before of crimes against humanity. Terabytes of data, often streamed live on social media, of war crimes, torture, chemical attacks on civilians, the barrel bombing of hospitals, rape, repression, and political arrests. But the reaction and sustained attention is almost in inverse proportion to the amount of evidence. In previous crimes against humanity, there was always the excuse that the world wasn't aware of what was going on. The Holocaust, we didn't know or pretended not to. The slaughter of Bosnian Muslims by Serbs in Srebrenica happened too quickly to react to. The genocide in Rwanda, politicians knew, but humanitarian organizations didn't and couldn't pressure them. And now everyone knows everything all the time, but it means less than ever before. The tableau of crimes remains a mess of broken images and doesn't add up to a coherent picture with a clear story, let alone coherent consequences. I think this felt different in the Cold War. Then there seemed a connection between the arrest of one single Soviet dissident, for example, and a larger geopolitical, institutional, moral, cultural, and historical struggle. The media, books, and movies of that time told the stories of discrete political prisoners and human rights abusers as part of a larger, joined-up tale in the great battle of freedom versus dictatorship, a battle for the soul of history. And the whole story made publics and democracies feel better about themselves, was part of an identity. We are on the side of freedom versus tyranny, good versus evil. And this, in turn, correlated with institutions that supported this narrative and identity. Political prisoners would feel that little bit empowered when information about their arrest was somehow smuggled to the West, announced on the BBC or Radio Free Europe, taken up by Amnesty International, announced at the UN, raised by US presidents and bilaterals with Soviet leadership. Sometimes this pressure would even get somebody released. You see here all the elements that together sustain attention, a greater narrative within which discrete events are given meaning, an identity that reinforces, a connection to a bigger geopolitical interests and institutions. One criticism of that grand narrative was that it privileged victims who fit into a certain Cold War point of view over others. Priests murdered in Poland by the communists would get more attention in Western media than priests killed by US allies in El Salvador because they fit into a framing which Western governments prioritized and promoted. I mean, that is not an unfair critique. I can see why people would argue that, and it should have spurred us to include a wider array of cases into a greater story of the struggle for human rights against political repression. For a brief moment in the 1990s, it did, as the wave of democratization overturned both pro-Soviet and pro-American dictatorships across the world, as the International Criminal Court was set up in The Hague in 1998, as humanitarian interventions were waged successfully from the Western Balkans to East Africa, it seemed that justice would be meted out more equitably. But then something different happened. Instead of letting more characters into the human rights story, the whole story collapsed. A situation where some victims got more attention than others has been replaced with a situation where no victims get any sustained attention at all. The initial impetus, impelled by the horrors of World War II that resulted in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and the subsequent slow expansion of freedoms and waves of democratization has run aground. Here's David Miliband, a former British foreign minister, now the head of the International Rescue Committee. There's a quote from him. "The checks written out in 1945 to the most vulnerable people in the world, marked international humanitarian law, are bouncing." He calls this the age of impunity, where anything goes and the law is for suckers, a time where war crimes go unpunished and the laws of war become optional, a time when militaries, militias and mercenaries in conflicts around the world believe they can get away with anything, and because they can get away with anything, they do everything. What happened? If attention is connected to a grander narrative, when and where did it come apart? Can it be fixed? The collapse came partly from inside. The language of rights and freedoms became hollowed out by leaders who misused it, leaving husks empty of meaning. Here's George W. Bush talking about the invasion of Iraq in 2003, connecting it with the fall of the Soviet Union. "President Reagan said that the day of Soviet tyranny was passing, that freedom had a momentum that would not be halted. Iraqi democracy will succeed, and success will send forth news from Damascus to Tehran that freedom can be the future of every nation." Instead, the invasion brought civil war, hundreds of thousands of deaths, and people in rich democracies soured on their own self-identity as part of a momentum fighting for freedom against tyranny. Words imbued with powerful meaning in East Berlin and Prague lost their purpose in Baghdad. Images did too. Pulling down statues of Soviet dictators was one of the iconic pictures of the overthrow of Soviet totalitarianism in 1989, a symbol for a whole concept of historical process. When statues of Saddam were torn down after the US invasion in 2001, international news agencies rushed to film them in a direct echo of 1989, as if the images themselves could reaffirm a historical thesis. Now, those images, like the words, have lost that resonance. So when today Ukrainians pull down statues of Lenin as part of their war with a dictatorial Russia and to overcome the Soviet totalitarian past, this might resonate locally, but it doesn't plug into a global electric circuit of meaning. Doesn't light up some great neon sign called freedom that glows from Los Angeles to Manila. Many Ukrainians feel their war is part of an older, deeper drama that should matter to everyone, that they are fighting, that you are fighting for an idea of the West, of Europe, for freedom against oppression. The people in the West or Europe don't want to be part of this story anymore. So Ukrainians are left alone, their struggle deemed a regional issue at best, or at worst an irritation, reminding the thing once known as the West unpleasantly of what it once was, the mistakes it made, and how shriveled it is now. Along with this rot from inside was the attack from the outside. The great leitmotif of contemporary Russian and now Chinese propaganda is that the desire for freedom and the fight for rights leads to prosperity, but to misery and bloodshed. Leads not to prosperity, but to misery and bloodshed. Russian propaganda channels like to edit together shots of people-powered revolutions in Syria or Ukraine, splice them together with images of the ensuing conflicts in these countries, as if the war was the inevitable product of revolts, rather than the response by dictatorships to crush them. And like democracy, the not-so-subtle message goes, dictatorship is strong and stable. And the grand democracy narrative came apart because of the logic of its own contradictions. None was so naive as the idea that free markets make free people, that capitalism and democracy were a priori linked. When Volkswagen, a car manufacturer that initially became rich on slave labor in Nazi concentration camps, makes cars in areas of China where political prisoners are used as slave labor in modern concentration camps, then we are reminded that big business has always adored dictatorships. And there are more systemic reasons, too, for the end of the grand narrative. Time is one. The sense of moral agency powered by the past is waning everywhere. In his epic satire of the EU, Capital, the Austrian novelist Robert Menasse describes bureaucrats who no longer remember the horrors of World War II, of the Holocaust and totalitarianism, the EU was created to overcome. They work in the EU, but they don't understand or remember why the EU was created. Technology is another reason. In a world of kaleidoscopic, fractured media, grand narratives just don't seem so viable anymore. That belonged to a world of libraries, lined with a limited number of canonical books chosen by a tiny band of men that defined what mattered. You weren't educated unless you'd read Solzhenitsyn, Primo Levi, James Baldwin, unless you'd read the right essays in the right yellowing magazines. And it belonged to an era of one-to-many broadcasting, when a few TV and radio stations could reach millions with the same message. The very nature of the media through which we make sense of ourselves today is different, resistant to the imposition of one coherent story. It's this last technological part especially that makes me sceptical we can ever go back to any coherent, grand democracy narrative. So where does that leave my friends in Belarus, Burma, Hong Kong, Tbilisi, Kiev, Lviv? What can one say to whole countries who are being victimized by dictators next door, like Ukraine, who struggle to hold the world's attention? How can one write anything that has a greater meaning? What should I answer to the message from Minsk? This year's Nobel Prize winners, they give us a clue. The prize, as you all know, was shared by two journalists, Maria Ressa, the editor of Rappler in the Philippines, and Dmitry Muratov, the editor of Novaya Gazeta from Russia. And if we look at their work closely and the context they work in, we see something interesting emerging. Maria Ressa's plight, her fight, could have been utterly esoteric to the world. She is a journalist under attack from the Philippines government for criticizing the extrajudicial murders carried out by the president, Rodrigo Duterte. Look, journalists come under attack every day across the world, and in the Philippines are regularly killed without drawing much attention in the West. Even Duterte's extrajudicial killings that Maria reported on, with thousands killed by pro-government gangs, corpses piling up in the alleys of Manila, that barely gets a global headline. Yet Maria managed to make her story global so that it holds attention. How? When she dug in to what was happening to her, she saw that there was something just below the surface that was both new and universal. There was something in the form of Duterte's attacks, his use of online troll armies and cyber militias to intimidate, besmirch, break his opponents. That was new. He was not merely imposing censorship. He was overloading social media with noise so the truth was blotted out, creating armies of fake social media accounts that distorted reality. So Maria made the issue not just about the Philippines, but also Facebook, the harms of social media, the lawlessness of digital disinformation. Her campaign and the way she told her story led not just to the presidential palace in Manila, but also to Silicon Valley, to every election distorted by online manipulation, to every conflict fueled through digital hate campaigns, to every woman or minority bullied or harassed on social media, to any parent worried about what's happening to their kids online. It became vital for any parliamentarian and civil servant thinking about what's happening and how to regulate this new online world. It updated how we think about freedom of expression in the digital dimension, forcing the tech companies to at least notionally admit that what they call inauthentic coordinated campaigns, the distorting products of troll farms, were not a form of legitimate speech, but actually a form of censorship. One real person saying one unpleasant thing is fine, but when a troll farmer pretends to be thousands of non-existent people saying the same thing, that's something different. And that can be regulated against. And Maria's research joined up countries that had never been put into the same sequence. No one has ever thought about Russia and the Philippines together. Their dissidents don't meet. They were on different sides in the Cold War. But now, these two capitals of online manipulation became part of one jagged but coherent story. Maria looked to the brave investigations of Putin's troll farms by Russian journalists to understand what was going on in her own country, began to see Russia and the Philippines as one front line of digital disinformation. The fact that Maria received her prize of Russia's Novaya Gazeta, a newspaper that first investigated Putin's troll farms, is not entirely coincidental. And Russia was one of the birthplaces of another seemingly local issue that became a global narrative. When Russian activists and journalists first tried to tell the world in the early Putin era about how their regime was based on stealing money from state assets and then laundering it abroad in Western countries, most shrugged. Who cares? I would often hear from London's opinion and policymakers, yeah, it might be bad for Russia or for Ukraine. The argument went, but it made London and New York richer, and if one was being very cynical, it was also making the Kremlin weaker. It took a decade of slow, painful arguments, evidence, data mining to show that corruption in Russia and Nigeria, Central Asia and the Middle East was not just a local tragedy. There were a new way to infiltrate and undermine democracies, compromise our foreign policy, distort the motivations of politicians, fund far-right political parties. They created an elite who used that influence and leverage to start wars and get away with it because Western countries were now so dependent on their corrupt investments. It was creating a world where the global rich were living with another set of rules, free of domestic justice anywhere. And that in turn was fueling the inequality and anger that undermined people's faith in democratic institutions. And the enemy was not just the Kremlin, but also among the middlemen and money launderers in respectable offices in New York and London, the system that pervaded shell companies. It was a long journey to show that the tragedy, for example, of a hospital in northern Russia pillaged by bureaucrats buying property in London was also something that people in the Pentagon should care about. Today, corruption, to be more precise, kleptocracy and money laundering, has become a central security agenda for the new US administration. But it took years of work to make those connections, to unearth the links that lie beneath all the noise of news and the narcissistic gaze of social media, and to make something seemingly tangential a story that runs through all our lives. So that is the task. To unearth the interconnecting tendrils of issues, intertwining roots of problems that crisscross the world more intensely than ever, but have yet to be told and even noticed, and whose larger significance is yet to be discovered. Before, the grand narrative of democracy used to pass above us like an overhead train that you could board from a platform called human rights. Now we work with shovels, prodding on a mound that seems just an anomaly in one corner of the golden garden, of the global garden, then excavating and pulling away at it to find that the rhizomes that sprawl and lead us back to the house, into the garden next door. This is a new mission for that always transforming thing called journalism, to find these hidden interconnections, to work out why an issue in Manila is also about Silicon Valley and about Moscow and about you, to find a sudden intersection between countries no one ever thought about as part of a single map before, then excavate what and who is actually to blame and what to do about it. Because these new lines are there. They don't need to be created, they need to be unearthed. And then one discrete event can have meaning for many. One newspaper article can lead to change. Digital rights and corruption are just the start of understanding what democracy means today. And they in turn can be part of something even bigger. Belarus can seem alone in this. It isn't. For though the old story of waves of democratization, of easily defined and relatable declarations of human rights, that's faded. People still risk their lives and livelihood to protest and fight for, well, fight for what? We have had in recent years seen more protests across the world as at any time for decades, from Hong Kong to Tbilisi, Sudan to Chile, and of course Belarus. Belarus, which was always dismissed as happy with its loose dictator, which was supposedly satisfied with the compromise between stability and rule of a single man. And then suddenly, impossibly, the whole country rose up. Not just urban liberals, but pensioners and factory workers. Belarus is not some lonely island in the ocean. It's perched on a huge submerged great whale of protest that stretches from Asia through Central Europe and Latin America. But unlike in 1989, we don't think of all these protests across the world together, don't see them as part of one inevitable coherent history. The regimes they fight are different. It's hard to use simple binaries like democracy against dictatorship. The rights they ask for can be incoherent or disparate, and yet something still itches away at people, some sort of underlying urge, a need that can't be satisfied. How can we find that common strain? What connects all these different movements? What if all our talks of waves of democratization, even the Declaration of Human Rights, were just the surface expressions of something deeper, angrier, which can find expression in new ways? What will we find in our process of unearthing, our excavation? Maybe, lurking underneath, we will find something that is coherent. All the tendrils leading to a whole, something alive, huge, global, terrible. With millions of swirling with millions of swirling limbs to mete out justice and revenge.
Я вам дуже дякую за увагу. У нас залишається до наступної лекції.
Stricha. I think that we can go have some coffee before that, but I'm going to use this opportunity and I will try to send link to pass a bridge from Peter's lecture to Yaroslava's lecture, who's going to talk about Ukrainian theater. I would like to remind that we had to have Hanna Ulura in this place. He would talk about dramaturgs and demiurgs. Maybe that connection would be more obvious, but as you have seen, Peter was talking mostly about media. And to explain this connection, I have to say several very banal phrases, so I excuse me in advance. So today's day is called theatrocracy, and I have not realized even myself immediately that the etymology of this name that means power of event, of entertainment. Theatron is the place where audiences sit. So this is basically the power of audience. And the very banal thing that I wanted to say is that as we imagine ourselves, its civilization is closely connected to space we are sitting in right now. On the one hand, it's model of the theater, which is familiar to humanity, which has been familiar to humanity for 1,000 years, but on the other hand, that's how democratic institution works. This is a city hall. This is reunion hall, meeting hall of the city council, and that's how democracy is happening. And antique theater at that time also was medium at that and a way for civil education. So basically, the role was the same that media is doing for us this day. Or at least they have been doing this until recently, because now media is having some very difficult times and they reinvent themselves. Partly that's what Peter was talking about. Yaroslava Stricha, who is a literature critic, as I have already mentioned, and her dissertation in Harvard was defended on the basis of biographies of Ukrainian writers. And the period that she's dealing with is the end of the 90s, beginning of the 20th century, which obviously cannot be imagined without classic Ukrainian theater of Corinthians. I do not think that many of us often address such dramatic works and reread them. That's not my favorite page in Ukrainian literature, but it's also closely connected with Ukrainian identity. So we have this famous quotation of Skoropadsky. It was not very friendly in the original, but about the fact that Ukrainian activists were brought up by the theater, and that's where we have pluses and minuses. He was talking more about minuses, and I actually asked Yaroslava to investigate this side, so how we really are brought up on theater, how Ukrainian theater influenced on how political activist Ukrainians would become in some time after this. And it was a huge, it was very interesting for me why exactly Ukrainian theater managed to avoid those censorship prohibitions and amskukas. And Yaroslava is going to talk about this in 12:30, and I now suggest going behind curtains a little bit to have some coffee. Thank you.
Can you see me? Can you hear me? Yaroslava, I can see you on the monitor, but our audience cannot see you yet. Okay, but at least you can hear me, so the sound is okay. The echo of your voice is spreading in Lviv City Hall. So this is the saying about the choreophys being better than the new generation, and we cannot even make a connection to discuss these choreophys of the Ukrainian theater, but that was just a joke. That's okay. I hope we can make it. So, Yaroslava, I think we can start already. I have already introduced you before we had a coffee break. And if somebody is just joining us, I will tell you that we are going to have a Zoom lecture by Yaroslava Striha, a literary studies scholar and translator, who will be telling us about the Ukrainian theater, the theater of Korify, and she will tell us how this theater is connected to Ukrainian political class. I'm not sure whether I'm very accurate in this expression. If I wasn't, then Yaroslava will correct me. Yes, you are very accurate. Thank you, Oksana, for the introduction. Thank you to everyone who is listening to us. I'm sorry that since we are speaking about theater, but yet we are virtual, we are having an online lecture, but I will try to tell you the story of a poor nobleman, downshifter veteran of the Russian army with the Cross of George, theater critic and member of students' unions. The people that are not normally associated with saving of the world. So these people laid the foundations of the Ukrainian civil society and Ukrainian independence. So this is a true story. Our list of characters. So entrepreneur, a poor nobleman from Poltava region, Grigory Ashkarenko. In 1880, he founded the first professional drama group in Kremenchuk. Apparently, the AIMSU case was in effect back in the day, which prohibited the use of Ukrainian language during performances and the use of Ukrainian languages in general. But Ashkarenko, in his memories, writes that even though the theater was formally Russian, but they still had all the costumes, Ukrainian coats, Ukrainian female clothing, and so they started staging Ukrainian performances illegally. So we are speaking about Moskal Magician, fellow Mailer, Natalka Poltavka, and Nazar Stodola, but he wasn't very successful, and the memories of Marko Kropivnitsky speak about that. But once the actors for the role of the romantic theater, the actor who was supposed to play the romantic theater took all the money they had, all their budget, and just escaped. So Marko Kropivnitsky, who at that time was already a member of that theater company, told Ritsko that he had a young officer, a handsome man, a charismatic one, member of amateur theater, who could play that main character. And Sadovsky, that was the name of the man, he agreed. His only condition was that the theater was using Ukrainian language, and Ashkarenko shrugged his shoulders and did what any person would have done in his situation if that person had no self-preservation instinct and no common sense. Ashkarenko sent a telegram to the omnipotent Minister of Internal Affairs, Loris Melikov. Ashkarenko wrote that he was a nobleman, a Russian patriot, that he created a theater, but he was in such a complicated situation that he couldn't end the theater season nobly because he didn't have enough money. So he was asking from that minister to stage performances in Ukrainian to attract the audience and to pay the salaries to his actors. We remember why it was a bad idea, because the MCU case was still in force. But let's have a look at the social context, the broader social context of the Russian Empire at the time, so that we have an understanding of how theater was regulated in general. So what was Russian Empire of the second half of the 19th century? It wasn't as strong after the defeat in the Crimean War, and it was clear that the country required some reforms, and public life was becoming more dynamic. Local self-governance institutions were created, local dumas were established, and these institutions were not established here on our territories because we had the Polish rule here, but nevertheless, in the cities, professional groups were established, groups of teachers, lawyers, and doctors who were not part of that vertical context, who were ready to advocate for their rights. Then serfdom was abolished. We understand that it was just a half measure which contributed to inequality among the peasants, because people, not all of them, had money to pay for their own land, and some of them couldn't buy off the land belonging to them. That is why many of the peasants traveled to cities to work at factories, which resulted in industrialization. In late 19th century, the number of factories increased by a quarter, from 30,000 to 39,000. So we have these new economic elites, the new intelligentsia, and the new peasants. All of them met in the cities, and Ukrainian intelligentsia used to travel to the village to write something about the ethnography, about the life of others. At that moment, the peasants and intelligentsia met very closely, and they were no longer the other. They were already the people from whom the intelligentsia borrowed the symbols and the ideas about the future. So something had to be done about those peasants. Most of them were illiterate. We are speaking about the end of the 19th century. So on our territories, only 25% of women were literate and around 50% of men. In the 60s, there were some initiatives. We remember Drahomanov and the old Hromada. We remember the students and the elites who were trying to organize Sunday schools, evening schools, trying to teach these people to read and write. But these small private initiatives, in any case, could not bring some large-scale results. So, what could be the way out? Volodymyr Solovyov, who was doing a penitentiary reform back at the time, said, "Theater is like prison. It can be a factor of civilization." So they were having this large-scale debate in the Russian Empire, saying that theaters were a nice way of spreading morals and civilization among the peasants and to prevent them from drinking. So it was a win-win situation. But the government was not really in favor of such folk theater, because the minister Adlerberg at the time said that that theater could become a weapon in the hands of opposition, resulting in radicalization of the peasants. And all those ideas about moral upbringing and preventing people from drinking were just a smokescreen, because theater wasn't going to be cheaper than having a glass of some alcohol. And theater, even the most affordable one, had to be regulated strictly. So at the time when in Ukraine and across the Russian Empire the intelligentsia was meeting common folk, they started borrowing symbols of their identity from the common folk. So groups of people not connected to the government started appearing and started advocating for their rights. And if we speak about our territories, we've just had the Polish uprisal here, and there was the hysteria of the Ukrainian national movement. At that time, Ukrainian performances were prohibited because they could give birth to Ukrainian nationalists. So it was the time when this poor nobleman Ashkarenko wrote the letter to the Minister of Internal Affairs, and the minister was known for suppression of the indigenous peoples in Caucasus, in Kabarda. So that minister was known not to be very loyal to indigenous peoples. So, in other words, Ashkarenko stood no chance in that situation. He had zero chance. But as Hollywood blockbusters teach us, at the moment when the character has zero chances, everything turns otherwise. So, everything unthinkable becomes inevitable. I'm not sure whether it happened in that right way, but I have this impression. The telegram arrived within the last 5 minutes of Loris Malikov being the minister. Loris Malikov had a plan of constitutional limitation of the authoritative rule. As you may have guessed from the timing, several hours before the Tsar listened to this idea, he was killed by terrorists. So the person who took over from him wasn't surprised, and Loris Malikov resigned and left for a foreign country. And during the last 5 minutes of him being on the position, he read the telegram and he wrote the answer. So the answer was the following. So you are saying you are illegally staging Ukrainian performances when they are prohibited. You are staging these performances for common folk that will borrow some ideas from these performances. So please do stage them.
The first play that was officially loved was, of course, classic Natalka Poltavka. And it was a triumph. Tickets were sold like hotcakes, and as it was written in Kropotnitsky's memories, the change was extremely obvious, but theaters were not filled by chariots and but there were also some irregular carts because people were coming there from all farmsteads around and Cossacks. So basically, maybe some ancestors of and some still from some memory of Cossacks, and they still might have some historic memory. So Kropotnitsky was telling with a police man, and he was looking at all those people who were trying to buy tickets, and he says Ukraine has not yet died, and the policeman said yes, but it will soon die. and he looked at some farmstead guy villager who was trying to buy the tickets with who bought lots of tickets, and he asked, who did you buy those tickets for? He's like, for me, for brother, for mother, for all my relatives, because it's our native. Ruth mother is a native for all of us, close for all of us, says policeman. So as you have seen from the very first day of the first existence of sanctioned theater, even if it was limited, it was perceived as very close and a native one, and that's why this idea of national general Russian identity is not that close, even though theater tried to attract a newer audience, and intelligentsia found here actually new audience for themselves. And that was the question of repertoire already. Kropotnitsky could tell as much as he wanted that Natalka Poltavka was much better than Russian plays, because it was like this by realism and by but it was 1819, so the play had already 60 years, and everything was from there. Shельменко, Seller from Kvitko-Slavyanenko, 1835. Nazar Stodola was considered to be absolutely a new play, though it was from 1843. I do not say that art goes all that fast. No, it doesn't work like this, but they were living in the time of very fast social changes, and theater that was appealing to different types of society, layers of society, gave some keys how to form new identity. And Ukrainian drama at that time couldn't suggest anything like this, because there was not enough of Ukrainian drama for that time. And it would be a problem if we didn't have our next acting person, Don Shifter Ivan Karpenko-Karый, real surname Tobilevich, 1845-1907, years of life. Karpota Bilevich placed lots of hopes for his older son. He had not very fast but still very stable career. He worked as scribbler in a small village, then later he worked in a little bit bigger village, then in court. Then he moved to Yelisavetgrad, where he worked in the police, so he was in a way head of the department. And it was almost 25 years of his service, and he could have gone for pension, but there was a case that changed everything. When he was in Bobranets, by the way, with Marko Kropotnitsky, who we mentioned earlier, there were several TBL actors, and there was only one pianist who could accompany them in those vaudevilles. If she declined, then history of Ukrainian literature would go in absolutely different way. But she looked at that poor actors who were extremely thin and even skinny, and she says, "Let it be. I will accompany them." Kropotnitsky and Karpenko-Karый, Tobilevich at that time joined them, and then you understand, where you have theater, you have some strange publications, some strange relations. So Tobilevich family, and one day Ivanko came and says, "Success! I have such a great success at work." And they say, like, "What? Have you been promoted?" And the answer was, "No, me, such a small person as a secretary of police, I was fired by telegraph letter of Interior of the Ministry of Internal Affairs." And then 2 years in Novocherkassk, the Russian Empire lost professional, but Ukrainian literature gained dramaturg who managed, among those censorship, still create those dramas that were dealing with topical problems, relevant problems of life at that time. What was under censorship for that time? So let me please cite this principle for you. Censorship has to differentiate between good thoughts based on God and nature from some very important thoughts that are not very they're not very in accordance with what we were believing in. But generally, what was prohibited, texts that were talking about socialism and communism, that encouraged people to get rid of anarchy, and it's from 1860s, so they knew probably something. Texts where it was written about some hatred, so that's why plays about serfdom were very difficult to plays. For example, Figaro of Mozart was prohibited for this popular theater, even though passages about tyranny and tyranny was cropped from the original. But still, there are some intrigues. There are those mentioning of first nights, so you don't need to irritate people in that year about with all of this. Maybe you have noticed that in Ukrainian prose, we have lots of priests. It's one of the main characters in the Chuy Levoitsky and other prosaic works, but we do not have them in dramatic works because they were prohibited. It was prohibited to depict monks, icons, priests, and not only of Orthodox but also of Catholic churches. So, for example, magician, witch of Victoriana Sardou, they took away stages with Inquisition because a person who was not educated could not differentiate between our church and Inquisition. It was forbidden to show rulers. It's still from the time when Uvarov told to Mykola I that the revolution in France started from the play of Saint Bartholomew's Day Massacre. There were some exceptions, but of course there were some very strange prohibitions. For example, in 1905, they prohibited to play Sardanapal by Byron, but because they decided that it was not very good to show in 1905 some riots against Tsar, even though Tsar was good, but everything that was immoral and everything that was connected with drinking was prohibited, even if they changed in the end. For example, with Karpenko Kari Bastalanna, there were some problems because they deleted practically everything out of it, and they say what we already deleted everything, and but the censorship was saying that yes, I remember this play, but it finishes with killing. The guy kills his wife because of his lover, and he says yes, but it's not the only one. We have lots of literature like this in Russian literature. Yes, but can you imagine that a guy comes home and he wants to kill his wife, but then a wife picks up their child, and then the husband changes his opinion, and he's like, yes, but in that play they do not have children. But yes, but you can write the children in there. So basically, only because of charm of Zankovaitska, they managed to still stage this play, because she had very wide circle of fans, and she to everybody she told there is a role, there is a play with a role written for me, and I'm going to dedicate this play to you. So I do not have charisma than Kovaitska has had, but you understand the general principle. And Sadovsky came to take this play, but it was written that it's a loft, but it was not a previous name. It was called Bastalanna. Okay, but at least it's according to censorship. Okay, so I still have censor prohibition. It was also prohibited to show life of intelligentsia, because all of them were considered to be separatists, Ukrainian separatists. They start from intelligentsia, and then till 1890s, they also didn't let anything from life of sellers and so on. So as soon as there was some coat scene, which was more expensive than the regular layman coat, it was prohibited to stage it. Texts that criticized administration or courts were also prohibited. In publication it was allowed, but in books where we have more than 10 pages, it was not possible to do so. So it was some kind of censorship also to the access to the information, but in the theater it was also present. It was formalized to the end of the 1880s when ministers of internal affairs, Tolstoy at that moment, introduced separate censorship for accessible theater, because that something that may not be temptation for educated people can actually lead less educated people to something. It was especially relevant about for historic plays, for example. In regular theater, it was possible to stage Ataman Ustinya Fyodorovna, but it was forbidden in regular simple theater, because censorship told that those simple people would not differentiate between 17th and 19th century and then would like to have such free life now. In the case of Ukrainian theater, it's even worse. But for example, they tried to put through censorship Bogdan Khmelnytsky by Stritsky. They cut practically everything out of it. Author couldn't recognize this play already, even he himself could not do this. Then Stritsky Chernykhivska came to center and he asked, well, so what's the problem? And he told the problem is not in the sense, the problem is in Ukrainian. Yes, but Ukrainian stages are already allowed. Yes, but not all of them. It's not very good for people to see such play in such language. But why? Because little Russians do not understand Russian language, but understand Ukrainian, so we do not want them to understand this play. How they omitted censorship, how avoided censorship, I will tell you later if we have some time. Please ask me later. So what is the space left for dramaturg? It seems that there's nothing is left. She can just write some vaudevilles from the popular life without any historic realities, without any problems that really could worry somebody, and basically this repertoire that they were criticized for. But in reality, no. Karpenko-Karry found a way to find a way. So look at we all know those plays, 100,000 Master and Martin Burula, even through by Karpenko-Karry. Even now through Zoom, I see that you are very bored already, because we read it as a very specific moral play, as it is written in annotation. 100,000 is a play where they laugh at desire to get lots of money. Master is also about somebody who cares most about money. Martin Burula is a satire for a person who would like to become a nobleman and be more higher than others. But it seems to me that it is more productive to read those plays as plays about tectonic changes or social changes of that age, as an attempt to have some signpost for people who are living in all of that, but at the same time, old system, what they belonged to, the group they belonged to, fell. Dramaturgs tried to explain in which groups they could be integrated now, but already with some social aspect. It was the era when aristocracy moved to the second stage and already left the stage as economic player. So we remember how 100,000 started. Gerasim, maybe he used to be a serfman, and you can go for 3 days and it will be all his land, whose land he bought of those masters who lost their lands. Yes, it's very typical for such people to do something like that, to steal everything from them. But those new masters of life, they tried to orient it somehow. They already understood that they can, if they give money for some shelter, they will get some Nobel prizes. If they understood that, for example, in the play Master, it was depict, but they do not understand. This old generation, all that were depicted in the plays, they all has PTSD. Every centimeter of their land is in blood, so they are going to kill everybody who would call them villagers or like well, ill-educated, ill-mannered people. But nobody will call their children like this. But their children already think about right of women, right of women for education, about some social identities. And Karpan Kokari was talking here to his audience. His audience was local city workers who went to theater. It was the first generation who moved from villages and from villages to cities and factories. So to the theaters they were going not just to have fun, but also because it was part of their local city identity. Intelligentsia goes to the theaters. We are going to do this as well, and we are going to have some values from them. And of course, it feels funny for them in Martin Borula, though it was very difficult for him to try to imitate such activities. So it was very funny for them when they saw some. When they saw some examples when main character of Martin Borula did not know how to drink coffee, though he knew how to drink tea, and he tried to change his way of life. So they recognized themselves in that experience. Or, for example, Borula was saying that he was already almost a nobleman, but still cannot sleep for a very long time in the morning. But he still, I need to learn how to do this, because if, for example, I need to sleep as much as possible to show that I'm a real nobleman. But at the same time, this mass culture where workers, villagers, new classes, layers of intelligentsia, lawyers, teachers, met humanitarian intelligentsia, this mass culture that was created this team, and here they tried to share their ideas. For example, if you become a nobleman, you can get some social identity. Karpenko Kari was laughing at the main character in the Master, though he did not want to give money for the monument of Kotlyarevsky. He says he's nobody for me, and he heard from his interlocutor, okay, so you are absolutely not going to be famous because you are such a master that will not even be remembered, and will not absolutely be remembered for somebody who promoted literature. And we had article about Yefremov about this called Kyiv Puzir, that was the name of the main character. Those plays reminded about social responsibility.
So you can become a lawyer and a agronomer, but you also have responsibilities in front of your society, because you have used everything from that land. You took everything from that simple redneck and left them behind. Karpenko Kari also articulates that women need to be educated. We know that it was something that he was passionate about. He spent his daughters to get education in Paris, and he said that the problem of the society was because we didn't have educated women and girls. Women, when they're a national element, are the strongest power in the revival of a nation. And Suyeta, his play, which was prohibited, that is something that it also discusses. He has a character who graduated from a gymnasium and she wants to go to some medical colleges, but everybody laughs at her, telling her that she was supposed to get married instead. In between those drops of censorship, we have intelligentsia appearing. We remember the main comic contradiction in 100,000, where we have Herasim, who is buying off lands, who takes care of money and who has this deal with the devil for the first time in the Ukrainian literature, buying counterfeit money. And we have his friend Kopach, the other character, who was a commander during the Crimean War, but now he is retired, who doesn't have enough money and who probably won't have much in the future. What he does, he's digging. He's dreaming about some type of sculpture. He wants to find it somewhere to unearth it. And Harasim laughs at him, telling him that he's just boasting, looking for money for more than 30 years. And Kobach replies to him that he has found some relic tree, a very heavy one. He found also some instruments, a pan used in the kitchen. So this funny character, Kopach, the digger who didn't manage to earn money, he saves the day. And when Herasim goes bankrupt after his deal with the devil and he tries to commit suicide, Kopach saves him. So this is a kind of a prophecy, because in this situation of uncertainty of the late 19th, early 20th century, Ukrainian community could not count on the economy, on the army, which was non-existent. They couldn't bank on the intelligentsia with their funny dreams about stone monuments. But it was enough for them. We can be as ironic as we want about the central Rada, but if it wasn't for them, our striving for independence would have been even shorter or would be virtually non-existent. But the very fact of Ukrainian performances existing did not mean that it was Ukrainian separatism. Ukrainian theater aligned with the Russian imperial identity, just as staging of performances by Stefanik in Transcarpathian dialect doesn't mean some separatism in Ukraine. So the theater season of 1886 and 1887, when Sadovsky Theater Company had a tour in Petersburg and Moscow, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, they were very successful and they made 18,000 karbovancy. And just to compare the salary at the time, the salary for a general was 500. A horse cost 100, so it was a huge success, and everybody was trying to invite hohols, or Ukrainians as they were called at the time, to that theater. The theater was so realistic that the people felt they felt the smell of bread when the curtains opened. So the Ukrainian theater fit very well into the folk tendencies of the time. Sadovsky wrote that for the first time those rich people saw the life of common folk they've only seen through the windows of their carriages, and they never knew about the sufferings and pains of common folk. So, in general, it was acceptable within the existing tendencies. Ukrainian theater was welcomed even at higher echelons. They performed for the great Princess Alexandra Osipovna, who was very much impressed, and she shared that positive impressions with her nephew Alexander III, who wanted for the performance to be staged at Mariinsky Theater. The Tsar was in awe, and Sadovsky tried to use that opportunity to improve the situation of the Ukrainian theater because they were having a tour in the capital of Russia, and at the same time they couldn't have their performances at the capital of Ukraine in Kyiv. The Kyiv general governor, who was responsible not only for Kyiv but also Poltava, Chernihiv, and Podillia. So Sadovsky complained to the Tsar about the general governor prohibiting Ukrainian performances, and Mr. Drenteln was the general governor at the time, and the Tsar replied that the governor was an old fool, and Sadovsky just confirmed that idea expressed by Tsar. Ukrainian performances were very well liked in Novocherkassk, where Prince Sviatokol Myrsky was in charge, whom Malcolm Marriage believes to be one of the best specialists of Russian literature in the West, where he fled after the revolution, who published his works in the Criterion, who was acquaintances with Virginia Woolf, and when he decided to come back to USSR, Virginia Woolf wrote that soon there'll be a bullet through his head. It's interesting that our theater of Corypheus knows Virginia Woolf through one handshake. Myrsky was not against Russian culture and Russian Empire in general, but he also liked the Ukrainian theater. So regardless of his intentions, the reception of Ukrainian theater in Novocherkassk was different. This is how Sadovsky describes it, and I'm citing. So the siege representatives on the oven moved like worms. The ray of sun for a glimpse entered the room. Having had a good drink and turning around, the policemen were whispering, "Ukraine is not yet dead." This is what Sadovsky wrote, the way in which Ukrainization spread among the society. So it wasn't so much about the Ukrainian theater. Performances were staged at the very center of the Russian Empire for the Russian Tsar. It's more about the practices happening around this theater. In the Russian Empire, with its strict censorship and prohibition of public meetings, theater became one of the only anonymous and relatively safe ways for the public to express their political views. And for the people advocating for the rights of the Ukrainian theater, it was a school of self-organization, a horizontal one, and where we have people coming from different communities and backgrounds. This experience of cooperation helps during the national revival movement. The practices around the functioning of Ukrainian theater will be exemplified on the example of our third character, already mentioned, Mykola Sadovsky-Tobilavich, the younger brother of Ivan Karpenko-Karys. So you remember how dissatisfied their father Karpo Tobilavich was about the career choices of the oldest son. So he thought that the youngest son could save the day because he did everything right. He graduated from a college, then he went to army, participated in the Russian-Turkish War. He went through all the war's battles. He was awarded with the St. George's Cross, and he was awarded the title of an officer. He was the first veteran prose in Ukrainian literature. And even though he didn't become a professional soldier, his father thought, he has a very good voice. So he can be a good dean, a good priest. But it so happened that the theater company of Oshkarenko loses their main actor, and our veteran of the Russian army, Sadovsky, receives the telegram and agrees to become an actor. This is how we get our famous theater director. This is how he was born. So in Kyiv, Sadovsky gives his first performance in 1882. That was Notavka Poltavka, and Larisa Staritska Chernyahivska said that the performance did not satisfy even the most modest requirements of the audience. Kropivnitsky tells about their performance from the other side of the story, looking through the curtains, seeing that some people were hiding behind columns, some were squatting. Everybody was just afraid. They were afraid of some provocations, and Kropivnitsky wanted to cheer up the actors who were going to perform for that audience. And he also saw that Oshkarenko and Kramarenko had something to drink in their dressing room. The play was outdated, the performance was not the best, the audience was afraid, the actors were not ready for the big stage, and a bit tipsy, and the audience has already seen Sarah Bernard and had high standards, so that tipped that performance for a failure. So it proved the point that Ukrainian language was a language of limited diffusion, that Ukrainian theater was again for a very limited audience. But after that, something quite unexpected happens. This is how the Kyivlyan newspaper wrote about this performance, and we can hardly think that this newspaper was in favor of Ukrainian language. So the audience of the Little Russian plays were not limited to loud applause and cheering. Everything produced an unpleasant impression on the audience. What something was not very impressive for some people was an existential change for the others. Staritska Chernyhivska had a very high evaluation of that first staging. She said we had the first generation of Ukrainian children not born in the village, those already brought up in the cities, who for the first time appeared in the environment where the identity was present and where it was dominant. And for them, visiting the theater was a kind of manifestation. They wore Ukrainian clothing, national Ukrainian clothes, and every time they did so, she said that people were engulfed with that feeling as if they were carrying a knight's sword, and Ukrainian theater and Ukrainian directors contributed to the crystallization of Ukrainian community and national identity. And this feeling is not limited to one group of people. It's mass art. When Sadovsky manages to rent the Ukrainian National House, it becomes the place for the most democratic theaters. So people from Solomenka, Shulyavka, and Demiivka come.
And on morning plays on Sunday and Monday, people could visit those plays for 5 or 15 kopecks to sit in the last rows. And we remember that Minister Adelberg said that theater cannot be cheaper than alcohol, but bottle of Horilka was 40 kopecks for that time. So that's why House Sadovsky won. So people from different spheres gathered there, and it was described by Stepan Vasilchenko in a following way. In one corner there was a group of village cooperators who they were arguing with some skeptic about Ukrainian language. Then some teenager came to them and was trying to popularize Ukrainian issues. Then some respected villager with big beard was trying to persuade somebody else that he understands a lot in Ukrainian issues. Well, were all audiences, were all viewers such conscientious? Of course not. That's the problem of all old viewers of old theater. We do not have some law research. We have only in Russian Empire only two views. One from them is from Kyiv. It's Miss Bulhakova. As far as I understand, she's not relative of well-known Bulhakov writer. It was very some easy reaction, like it's very great for my soul to be in the theater. Sadovsky was complaining that people do not go very well for some more difficult place, but they visit vaudevilles with a very big pleasure. And for example, there was a play, the only benefit of it was that it was loved by censorship, and he decided to change it a little bit and to have fire and crash of house. And he wrote there, do not get afraid in the because in the third act we are going to have fire. And people really, when they saw this on an advertisement, they still went there because they wanted to see this. But still public saw there some new national ideas, so they wanted to look at fire, but at least they found some other ideas. But there were also people of different ethnicities there. There is a great idea in Saksahansky memories about his tours. We need to understand that it's a Russian Empire of the end of the 19th century, where the state was trying to provoke anti-Semitism, and we had lots of people different ethnicities where they could work on something together, and theater was such platforms in Saksahansky. But group we had at least two Jews. Why it was the problem during the tours? Because Jews could not get settled in those areas, so he as head of a group always had to find some permission. Usually it was easy to get that permission, but at one point they did not want to do this. So in 4 months, when they already returned to Kyiv, they got this notification that the Jews cannot stay in Kazan. So this note was following them from Samara to Saratov to Novocherkassk to Rostov to Bakhmut to Kharkiv, and from Kharkiv to Kyiv. So here we can really get surprised by the territory that Ukrainian theater visited, because it was accepted everywhere there, but still there was not too much tolerance and readiness to work together, because there were no ethnic boundaries. So of course they could have found some conductor of other nationality, but still they wanted to fight for their rights. The same about theatrical critics. They started talking, they wanted to depict Jews better, and by the way, Simon Petlura was one of the most famous in the sphere because he criticized Russification of Jews in Chirikov place play Jews that was prohibited, but we know in Ukrainian literature such examples when Jews were depicted as metaphor of Ukrainians, with the same experience of stateless existence, but Petlura was not interested in Jews as metaphor. He was interested in a particular society, and he thought that this Chirikov's play, even though it was not aesthetically perfect, it should have had created new feelings towards this nation, and to understand that all national minorities are now suppressed by the empire, and they had to bring up anger, and this anger actually was something that had to destroy bad things going around. So that's how they tried to form the society, not by ethnic criterion, but as some space of criteria of cooperation. But Petlura is famous, of course, by what he was doing in the army, as they were saying. As he was saying that he did not control um, his army behind or beyond that those that train, but we did not have anybody else who was better actually in depicting Jews. But also Sadovsky decided to support this play Jews by Chirikov. He wanted to do this in Kyiv, but censorship did not let him do this. So next year he still managed to do this, and in the intermission, the police came and prohibited this. So he was trying still to do this. It was important for a man. Also, as soon as in Ukrainian they could have staged translated plays in Ukrainian, not only those which were written in Ukrainian, he started translating, Staritsky started translating drama, that something that was written in Yiddish, because theater in Yiddish was absolutely prohibited, partly because of anti-Semitism, but it was also because of pragmatic reasons, not enough censorship, not enough police that could follow the censorship following. So in 1880s it was prohibited, but it still existed. Sometimes director told we are going to have German language theater as of today, but sometimes he was just with poker face continued staging what they were staging. So in 1905, 1906, general gubernators of Warsaw and Kyiv were asking each other, are we allowed to have this Jewish theater or not? Because this is very well in a very well condition in our cities. So whatever it is, Yiddish in Ukrainian translation was the biggest part of the theater, even though people of different ethnic generation could have existed peacefully. But we also had this new communion, we and government. So we had those new representatives who were loyal to Ukrainians. So we already have heard lots of general gubernators who were not very for Ukrainian word, but there was one who was very much for it. It was Dragomirov. He really loved life. He asked Madeira he ordered Madeira from Madeira, and Sadovsky mentioned it's like some kind of Rzhevsky but alive. So for example, somebody wrote to Tsar, Dragomirov has been drinking for the third day, and Dragomirov answered, we are drinking for your health. And the governor asked, I'm very happy, but please stop doing that. And so they were they known each other still from Russian-Turkish war. There was this Russian. Imagine there was this Russian army staying over the Danube, and Drahomirov was leading all of this. And he's like, "Why are you bowing? Have you seen somebody who do you like? Do you know somebody there? You need to go and fight." So when the governor prohibited some kind of play, Sadovsky put on his St. George cross. At that time it was worn by real respected people, not like now, and he still got this permission without governor. But that was also the area where Ukrainians got experience in winning. So I will like to. So I started from this perfect idea, perfect story about Ashkarenko's situation as Croatians think, but even if it was about him, we would still win, because it was Staretsky who sold his real estate and got bankrupt when he put all money in Ukrainian theater. It's Lesenko who graduated from Leipzig Conservatory, and he could still have some uh, better career. So those such people, they wrote complaints in such quantities that I don't even know how in the empire they could do something else but looking through all those complaints. When the senator came for inspection to St. Petersburg in 1880, everywhere he saw some Ukrainians, and he prohibited, protected Ukrainian word. And Kiev and Kharkiv governors sent to St. Petersburg a letter that they have too many complaints. So, and in the end of 1881, Ministry of Internal Affairs, not Melikov but Tolstoy, let those Ukrainian plays, but he prohibited specific Ukrainian plays. So if it was in Ukrainian, then there should be the following play in Russian. I can tell you later how it was avoided, but even in this part Lviv, Ukrainians still didn't give up.
So here Saksagansky comes on stage and he starts writing petitions to the main department on publishing, even reaching the Senate. And in 1892 he receives the permission to stage Ukrainian plays. In addition, theater becomes a school of self-organization where different groups meet and which create the environment for Ukrainian life. And this is a unique case when we don't have this, where we have two Ukrainians, there are three hetmans. So Sadovsky again tries to get the right to perform in Kiev, so he tries to make a performance where all the proceeds from the tickets will be donated to charity. But that is just half of his idea. It was also happening in mid-August when students have already come back to the city. And when students arrange a demonstration, then it will be the end for the Ukrainian theater. So he approaches the head of the student community, Ivan Stashenko, asking him to take care of the students. So they have played the performance, and the back rows are silent. First, the governor and his wife start clapping. Ignatiev stands up, and people in the hall also stand up. The back rows are silent. Sadovsky comes up to the governor, telling him that there were no demonstrations, and it meant that Ukrainian performances could be staged. And he was just wondering what kind of audience it was, because they were not very welcoming to the performance. So in that way, Sadovsky had the permission to stage Ukrainian performances. And also Stashenko receives the organizational experience. He will later become the Minister of Education, who will Ukrainize Ukrainian school. Or if we speak about Lysenko, he creates the Ukrainian Club in 1908 for Ukrainian performances and concerts. I think it wasn't the right choice to have the adjective Ukrainian in the title. This club was shut down because it had the word Ukrainian in the title, and he renamed it into family club, which in Ukrainian sounds as Rodina and is similar to Rodina, fatherland in Russia. So this organization is not just cultural, it becomes a center for political life, for the society of Ukrainian Postupovtsi, who in March of 1917 created the Ukrainian Central Rada. And finally, theater becomes a cultural space, which is a finite fact from the ideas that Ukrainian theater can never exist, something expressed in the MCU case. We have reached this stage where the Ukrainian theater has always existed, we have always had our culture, so several decades have passed between the two statements. So Skoropadsky said that all generations of contemporary Ukrainian activists were brought up by theater. This was a critical statement, and here I would like to cite him. This is where love for theater and being in love not so much with the content but with the form comes in place. Many Ukrainians really believe that the announcement of independent Ukraine by the Central Rada was a finite fact. A Ukrainian label for them was something that couldn't be disputed, but they couldn't have been brought on something else, so they had this only chance and they used it to the fullest. So the performances during Ukrainian independence was very short, and it consisted on one act. After the decree of Tolstov, there were many other prohibitions, but something played once already laid the foundations upon which something more could be built, and better positions could be asked for. So it's quite possible that if it wasn't for their theatricality, their belief in culture, and their funny conspiracy networks, we wouldn't have been here talking about it today. Thank you for the attention. If anybody has any questions, I don't know how to organize it. Maybe you can just transfer them to me. For Yaroslava to hear your question, you need to speak into the mic. Introduce yourself, please. Welcome, Yaroslava. Irina Chuzhanova, theater studies scholar. I have my first comment. I would like to thank you very much for quoting that article by Lyudmila Staritska-Chernyahivska, 25 years of Ukrainian theater, dated 1907. It's indeed a significant text and a very important phrase that was mentioned, manifestation of the Ukrainian identity. So I have a question. It may be quite complicated, but I think these things should be voiced in the context which you were discussing. I mean travesty. About Bulhakov speaking about the government and the government using costumes, theatrical costumes, using by the government. So this is again him addressing Skoropadsky, the general of Ukrainian army, who didn't have a hetman's uniform in his wardrobe. So my question is, does the travesty decrease the level of Ukrainian identity for a government which manifests itself as Ukrainian? Thank you for this very controversial question. Yes, I believe it's very important, but what is no less important, of course, we cannot give exact answers, we can only hypothesize here, but I think that we should take into account the fact that symbols have different meanings in different times. For us, Shevchenko wearing this sheep hat, this is us emphasizing that he was a peasant. He is not a genius for us because he was a peasant, but because he was a great man. So if we were now putting up monuments to Shevchenko, he would be wearing something different. Remembering that Shevchenko wearing that hat was a kind of travesty for him. So if we again refer to that monument of Shevchenko, which was mentioned by Yefremov in his article, if we remember the correspondence between Ukrainian intelligentsia of the time, people were very irritated that there may have been a monument to Shevchenko wearing a suit, not that hat. So at the time, it was establishing revolutionary societal position to speak, to give a voice to the weaker party, emphasizing their unity with that weaker person. So I think maybe the theatrical travesty costumes, which we may perceive is unnecessary theatricality, this isn't Halloween, this isn't the Malanka Fest. At the time, the travesty could be perceived in a different way. And one attribute may have had completely different interpretations for different people. That's what I think. I hope I have at least partly answered your question. I think we've had another hand raised. Thank you. Olena Halata, literary studies scholar. So previously I wasn't the one raising my hand, so maybe we have one more question. So my question may seem very simple to you because I'm not a theater studies scholar. I used to come across the topic of theater of Korify when I was working with Mazhenko's archives in Kyiv, and I stumbled upon his working notes where he was noting down theatrical performances not year by year but day by day, putting down information about performances being staged in various cities. Why I stumbled upon these materials because there were dozens and dozens of pages there, and Bohdan Symbol published the materials of Mazhenko titled Saksyahansky chronological canvas. So this is a kind of statistics, more than 150 pages. I was impressed by the coverage of the audience in terms of territory and number of people attending the performances. So my question is, do we have a unified database, a contemporary database, so that we have an idea of the number of performances where we can not only speak about the text, but also the result, the work with the audience based on very specific data? Thank you, Olena, for this question. I'm very happy to see you here, and thank you. Unfortunately, I don't know anything about such single database. I know that we have researchers dedicated to specific personalities and specific periods. We have information about the Kiev period of Sadovsky theater between 1907 and 1920. Just learning about people who were able to be so productive and inspired under very complicated circumstances. We still have some 10 minutes left. If we don't have any more questions, then I would like to ask Yaroslava to come back to the episode which you mentioned during a lecture. Rehori, PE teacher, I have two questions for you. I liked your lecture very much, especially your attitude towards peasants. You know that in Ukraine we have opened the land market and the issues of the 19th century have been transported into the 21st century. So I'd like to hear your comment on that. And the second question, teaching of Ukrainian literature in our school. What is our sphere of education doing for children to fall in love with literature? That's the tragedy of Ukrainian education. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I am not a politologist and I can not tell anything about reform, and because I'm not a specialist there, and I would prefer not to tell anything in this sphere. But about teaching of Ukrainian literature, of course, we need to stress not so much on some Soviet interpretation, but on more fresh ones, on discussions, because this literature really has lots of very surprising sides, which can bring lots of happiness even when you do not wait for it, because you are traumatized by the way it was shown for you to you. Yaroslavo, thanks a lot. Maybe then we can actually finish a little bit. We have lunch, and then after lunch, cinema study scholar, theater director of Dovzhenko Theater, Ivan Kozlanko, is going to have a lecture. Ivan is going to be present here with us, and as far as I can imagine, cover he will continue the topic and more or less the same historic time that Yaroslava left for us. Yaroslava, it was magnificent. Thanks a lot. Thank you for listening. Thank you for attention.